Welcome to the Experts in Sport podcast, brought to you by the School of Sport, Exercise and Health Sciences at Loughborough University. Hi Serhat, welcome back.
Hi.
Hello. So last time we were on, we spoke about the new FIFA Football Agents Licence and the new regulations that have been brought into place today. But today, we're going to look a little bit more around minors. We'll have a look at your research around minors and agents in football, the findings and the impact of your research, along with your suggestions of how to help minors, parents and agents to improve their practice. So firstly, we're going to dig into your research. So what research have you been doing in this area?
I've been involved in two research. The first project I've been involved was funded by UNICEF UK. And in that work, and we completed 3 phases of that project. And in each phase, we looked at different aspects of recruitment practices of clubs in professional football concerning recruitment of minors. And then the second project is actually funded by the European Commission, Erasmus Plus project. And that is basically explores the migratory processes in football by athletes. And we try to understand the challenges they face in that process when a player moves from one country to another for football purposes.
So when we say minors, what age group are we talking about here?
So minors actually has got a regulatory definition within football. So FIFA regulations on the status and transfer of players defines minors as those under the age of 18. And we have utilized that regulatory definition, which is almost a global now, whenever there is reference to a minor.
So it's under 18 is what we're talking about.
Yeah.
And so we'll kind of, if it's okay with you, we'll kind of merge your research to look at kind of the findings of what you came up with. So we know that this research is global. You've worked with, I think, 5 confederations around this research.
Yeah, correct.
So it's global, and we're trying to you're trying to work out what's going on really with the recruitment of players across the world and what's happening with them.
And so this is with UNICEF project, yeah. So we did it at a global scale involving clubs from different confederations in football, and then with the EU work, because again it's a pan-European work, we had different partners in different countries. So therefore our data collection involved in different countries. So we had partners from France, Switzerland, Turkey, Serbia. So, and we did data collection in those regions.
Okay, so what are some of the key findings that you've had from this research?
So some of the key findings that, first of all, both in terms of recruitment practices in football and the migratory processes undertaken by the talent, involves a key stakeholder, and that is agent. And for me, like for my research expertise, this is something I focus on. So the role of agent, what they do, and how what agents do in practice then impacts on children's rights of the minor, and also how then its impact on the migratory process of the talent, but also their social inclusion, for instance, when they reach their destination country for the purpose of football. So, and some of the specific findings, therefore, for me, by focusing on the agent involvement in these processes, and what we identify is that it's generally agent malpractice.
Okay.
I mean, this is quite significant, and existing research already talks about this, but what we find is some further insight and new novel insight about the agent role and those malpractices. For instance, clubs were describing irregular approaches to minors by agents, and that's the way they define irregular approaches, where agents, when they are approaching minors, they don't follow the regulations. Because we know that in football, actually, the representation of minors are strictly regulated.
Yeah.
Now, also under the new FIFA football agent regulations, there are provisions which restricts what agents can do and cannot do when representing minors, and whether even, there is a requirement that agents need to comply in order to be entitled to even represent minors. And then also what clubs were telling us, that agents, they don't always follow the right protocols, whether like club might have protocols around engaging with minors.
So what are the kind of things?
The third parties, so from agents. And so this was defined as a problematic, because also another side of that issue is those irregular approaches. Clubs said agents also use false promises in order to lure minors to work with them. Now, when you therefore consider these findings, so what we are identifying, and hence I define this as agent malpractice. One is the practice that doesn't comply with regulations, so there is this regulatory non-compliance, but also it's based on false promises, so creating therefore false expectations, which then the minors rely on those false promises, and clubs describe that the impact on them then is the destabilization of the player, where suddenly their focus shifts from football, and some of the clubs were talking about how then some of the players had their career had nosed down.
There's so much going on there. So if we can kind of talk about some specific examples, are we talking that this is happening everywhere? Like, is this rife, or is there's quite a lot of good practice going on, but there's also some malpractice? Are there certain countries where these kind of things are happening, or is it happening across the board?
Very good question. So, because our research, as I said, the EU one is pan-European and UNICEF one was global, and it's we looked at these findings comes from different territories. Historically, we know that, for instance, although like what I'm describing is the novel finding in that respect, so existing research doesn't talk about it. But for instance, when we talk about the existing research focuses on the human trafficking, and where the role of agent is identified. For instance, that problem we see because of the migratory flow from those countries to Europe. We tend to see those problems either in Africa or in Latin America.
Okay.
So therefore, coming back to your original question, we try to develop that global outlook. But then again, some of these findings are quite prevalent in specific territories. And I suppose that is also linked to the governance standards. I must say, like, for instance, in that specific territory, where we look at, for instance, we talk about regulatory compliance, we know that certain national associations in football, they incorporated, they regulated representation of minors historically very heavily. But we know that in certain territories, national associations, the rules are not there. So therefore, I wouldn't say that these findings are across the board, but because there are a number of reasons that affects the prevalence of these issues in specific territory.
I say this to a lot of people. I have enough knowledge in most of these areas, having read things up and about it, to be dangerous, in that I don't know enough. So I'm going to ask you some kind of questions here. So I've worked in football, or previously worked in football, in and around football, and spoke to some African players who came over to the UK. And when we're talking about all these stakeholders involved in malpractices, first thing I don't know is what their expectation was of coming over to the UK. So I'm not sure what that was, but I do know some facts around something that happened with them coming over to the UK. So X amount of players came over to the UK, and pretty much they had been given money by their parents and their village and the locals to get them to the UK, because the dream was to play professional football. But I also know, having met some of these boys, that they were told by their family, if you don't get the opportunity, then don't come back, because we can't afford for you to come back, and we can't afford to kind of keep paying for your living. You're 14, 15, 16. It's time for you to become a man and kind of get on with things. And your opportunities in Europe are much better than they are where they currently were. Are those kind of things, the things you're talking about, those kind of things still happening? And to further that, when I was talking to these boys, like the pressure on those boys, knowing that their only hope was to try and make it as a professional footballer, getting over here, and, you know, they played against some clubs. And if I'm honest, watching them myself, thinking they're not of this standard. They weren't. And I'm sure there are players that are, but those players were not of the level who were going to make it as a professional footballer. And just thinking of that, their realisation of that, and then what to do. And I actually took these boys on a visit somewhere, and the coach of the team at the last minute pulled out of coming with me and dragged me to one side and said, whatever happens, don't let them out of your sight, because some of them will try and do a runner. And it was like, wow, you know this. You're not taking responsibility for this. You're putting this on me, who at the time was a lecturer in a college. And one of them did try and hide in the toilet. And, you know, we had to get the people around to go and find this person. I was kind of like, wow, what's going on here? I did manage to get them all back on the bus and get them back, so all was fine. But it just took me to all these issues that are around this. So we've mentioned their parents, we've mentioned the players, obviously there's agents involved, there's multiple stakeholders here. But where do we kind of go with that, kind of from your research and trying to kind of enhance the lives of these players? So that was specifically talking in Africa. But I imagine that dream to play in the Premier League is there. There's probably another avenue of this in the UK. Is this going on in the UK as well? So these promises that are made to players. So the promises to those players were, get your plane fare, we'll get you to Europe, and you'll get a pro contract. What are the promises that are happening still now, malpractice rise in the UK? Another further example, and I won't mention any names, but a very, very well-known player. When we were younger, the rumour was, you know what rumours are like, you know, we're talking 20-odd years ago, that somebody's dad got paid £10,000 for this player in a brown envelope. You know, we're talking back in the day, for this player to go from one club to a Premiership club, and that player did go on and do well. Are those things still happening now, or do we not know this?
I think, you touch a number of things there, Martin. And if we try to break them down, that the examples you are talking about in terms of, you know, the players coming over and potentially for the purposes of football, but then, as you said, if they are not good enough, or if the football comes to end, what research shows, and this is the concept of human trafficking in football or through football, and that's my colleague James Essen from Loughborough University, which we collaborate in UNICEF project, and is the lead PI, principal investigator in that project. We work together, which, you know, who conceptualizes these things as human trafficking, because, as you said, his research highlights that those players, they stay over because there is a, you know, involvement of the family. There are those expectations from these players. But I think where our findings, you know, the new insight is really interesting when we think about this broader understanding of human trafficking, that some of those promises that leads to this process is also false promises. And let me also add this, and in this process also there's involvement of fake agents. So we are talking about here the official agents. So those are those individuals that hold informal agent status. So by following the rules, and whether it's licensing now or historically registration with the National Association. So, but then there are those individuals out there who also portray themselves as an agent, and then they exploit minors and the family, and based on false promises. And a lot of those promises they make in terms of, you know, going to another country, playing football, it's not exist. So this is the scale of the issue. And for me, I think you are touching on a really important, now we are touching on really important, consideration. So what we are seeing here is, so agent is a key stakeholder, but then the impact is on the minor, and that's the child. hence the rights perspectives, and which this child requires protection actually from exploitation under UNCRC. That's the protection right for any child. And then we've got also the parents, the family, another key stakeholder involved in this process. So, and I think these examples and this understanding around human trafficking and role of the agents within in football and through football is extremely important. And then the other thing you are describing is where, parents are offered financial incentives in order to induce them into a representation relationship or induce their child, sibling into representation relationship with agents. This is again, it's a malpractice, and it's prohibited by regulations. So again, we are seeing that regulatory non-compliance, because this is what the issue is. Then how prevalent that is, I don't think there is any research on that. It's a phenomena that is talked about, but we don't have systematic research, and I think it's something to research. But then, as you can see, it's also extremely hard to research because
no one's going to say, "Yeah, I got 10 grand."
These stakeholders, if you get them as a participant, it would be hard to get those perspectives because they can be just incriminating themselves by saying those things. So it's a challenging aspect to research within the football industry and the agent market.
So, obviously I've given some examples there of malpractice. Are we missing any in particular? Because again, did all this come up in your research around things like offering parents jobs and offering houses and all these kind of things? Are these things that were coming up, or are these not? These are things that are out there in the ether. Are these the things that came up in the research, or were you not touching on what these malpractices were?
No, we didn't because the those participated in the UNICEF work were clubs, and with the EU project, in the EU project, those were athletes.
Okay.
So therefore, I think this is more about. Yeah, we haven't touched those.
So that's an interesting one, because we've spoken in the past about the stakeholders being the club, the agent, the player. But probably where I'm talking about with mine is the parents.
Yeah.
And I think that's a really interesting one. I know we've spoken about this off air in the past, that the parents are a real key here in minors. And there's a lack of understanding from parents of what an agent is, what a professional contract is, what kind of salaries players should be getting. There's so much misinformation and missing information for parents that an agent comes along and says, "Oh yeah, this is what we do," and they can just be taken on board.
Exactly.
And that's difficult.
And again, this is another key finding, and this research. This is from the UNICEF work, but we identify the family as a key stakeholder, but then what we identify the problematic nature of the family involvement in this space. So what we are finding, as you said, first of all, they don't understand what a football agent do. So therefore, what clubs, for instance, describing the situation is them as they become easy prey. And usually, again, once agent turns up, shows a photo with a player, high-profile player with a nice car, family thinks agent is legitimate, or they are a good agent, and from there on, agents exploit them too, and according to clubs, then the family also align with agent, and suddenly, therefore, agent is in control of the minor as well as the family.
Yeah,
and that's then dangerous situation again, because one is family as a duty bearer, because under the UNCRC, they are the key duty bearers, the parents, where they are not able to, for the minor, where they are not able to judge and understand and protect the minor from these malpractices. And then in the EU project, athletes actually, they talk about the players, they talk about the lack of information. They emphasize their lack of understanding, because we identify also lack of understanding on behalf of the player. They don't also understand what a football agent does, as well as the regulations, contracts, because it can be very complex. But they also tell us that there is not enough information. They cannot access the relevant information also, even if they want to know about these things. And this is another key finding we have. So both stakeholders and key stakeholders, minor players as well as parents, they lack understanding, and also there is lack of access to such information in the industry.
So your research is basically highlighting a lot of issues around false promises, malpractice of agents, irregular approaches from agents, destabilization of the player, exploitation. We touched a little bit on trafficking, very minimally we touched on that there. And then we've touched about the role of the parents. So we've talked, there's all these different stakeholders going on, and all these different relationships potentially going on at the same time. But there's a huge lack of understanding, particularly from the players and the parents' perspective. Mm-hmm. So from your research, what kind of solutions are you delivering to try and kind of sort this out, essentially?
Yeah, so I think let's start with with the conceptualization of a good agent practice. So in my research, this is now sort of my core focus, because we need good agent practice. So agents need to have a good practice that when they represent minors. And for me, we need to conceptualize. We need to understand what this good agent practice looks like. Once we've got that conceptual understanding, then obviously we need to turn it into the practice and into the reality. So conceptually, for me, therefore, based on our research, I identify 3 dimensions of good agent practice when they deal with minors. Firstly, understanding and complying with the rules and regulations, as well as legal frameworks when they deal with minors. So regulatory compliance, which requires regulatory legal literacy on behalf of the agent. Which is what we talked about previously in our previous podcast. We talked about licensing and regulation and the new things FIFA brought in. That be part of it. Yep. As well as, that FIFA football agent regulations governs the representation arrangements of minors by agents. But then there's also whole regulatory framework around international transfer of minors. Because a lot of these issues we are talking about, particularly when minors, leave their home country, FIFA regulates international transfer of minors. So that needs to be understood too. So there are two dimensions there, or two key regulatory frameworks that agents need to understand. And then the second dimension is understanding the player development and career progression. So those examples you gave, for instance, and when player comes to the UK, the minor, and the player is not at the required standard. And what we want, agents to be able to judge that and make those informed decisions about the pathways that minor can take. And this requires understanding of talent development. Because if you are a minor, perhaps you need playing time, isn't it? And then the decision needs to be whether a minor needs to be at a club where they can have that playing opportunity, playing time, or where at a high-profile club where they have no chance of playing, if they are even good enough, but then perhaps the financial package is more significant. So agents need to understand these dynamics and holistically understand how players can develop, young talent can develop, then make those strategic decisions And in this space also, they need to understand the role of the parent. Because what we know, again, from research, parenting in sport research, that parents are important stakeholders, and agents need to work collaboratively with the parents. Whereas what we see in practice, it might be tension between them once there is that decision-making process around the minor. And then finally, the final dimension for me, and it's the most important one perhaps, is the minor is also a child. So agents need to understand the concept of children's rights. They need to understand UNCRC, and they need to develop agent practice that is right-based and also child-centered. And that requires, obviously, always operating in the best interest of the child, giving the child voice in the decision-making processes, and also respecting their protection rights. So protecting them from exploitation, abuse, all that.
Yeah.
So for me, I think this is how I conceptualize the good agent practice.
With that good agent practice, what are you trying to do to get that information out there? Is the information you're trying to get out there to agents, or is it also to parents and players, or where are you with trying to get? Because I know you're trying to push some education around this.
Then from this conceptualization, for me now, next steps are about creating impact and creating those tools that where this conceptual understanding then and can be translated into the practice. And for that, I've been using education. As we talked about in the first program, I lead the sport education programs at Loughborough we run. So we've got our Kite Mark program, professional certificate program for sports agent, and we cover all these things around good agent practice. But also what I did, that I worked with FIFA. We were commissioned that work, and we developed actually a bespoke designated CPD course for agents on minors, working with minors. That course now part of the new FIFA regulations, FIFA football agent regulations, and actually it's a regulatory requirement that any agent who wants to represent minors now, they need to complete that course. And that course builds on this conceptual understanding that I just explained. So we've got the regulatory module, we've got the working practices module involving talent ID, parents, understanding parents, and then the working practices, transfers, trials, all that. And then there's also a children rights modules, which is about developing right-based, child-centered agent practice. So that work is out there, and now, as I said, it's within the FIFA regulations, so it's implemented, and I hope that we are able to, through that education, foster good agent practice by agents, by football agents. But then I also recognize that we also need to educate minors, players, as well as the family members, parents. Because they also need to understand and expect good agent practice in football.
Yeah.
Without that, I don't think we will have the complete picture. So we started with agents, and for me, I think the next step is educating minors around working with agents and what to do with agents, understanding rules and regs, for them to understand also, their development, career trajectory that they might take, and also understanding their rights as children. And then the same with the parents.
Well, just linking back into that, I think, if I've got this right, for agents to work with minors, do they have to do this additional minors course as part of the FIFA exam, or do all agents have to do it? Where's that at the moment?
Yeah, that's basically once agent become licensed, because that's the first requirement, isn't it? Then they need to also declare whether they want to work with a minor or they want to represent minors. And now once they make that declaration, then they need to first do that CPD course, which sits at the FIFA agent portal.
And when we're talking minors, I think there has been some changes with these regulations of when agents can actually approach or work with minors. So what age is that? So this can help educate parents potentially now. What age can agents actually officially approach minors to represent them?
So now this is first time actually in the history of the FIFA agent regulations. By FIFA, we are seeing that as a requirement now, that our restriction under the FIFA football agent regulations, there is that age restriction for agents to approach or represent minor. And what this is, therefore, agents, they need to verify the age of the minor first to ensure that minor is at the right age. So that's the sort of the key compliance aspect of the agent practice.
And what is that age? Is that the same across FIFA?
And that age is FIFA, the regulations describe as 6 months before the age the minor can sign their first professional contract. So if I add this, therefore, so this is now the rule. But the implications of this rule for agents then, as well as the parents, because that age when the minor can sign the first professional contract may vary from one association to another association, my advice and perhaps the good practice is agents to ensure that whichever territories they are operating get that information or identify that information from the regulations of their national associations, so and know what that age is and work from there. Or other, I think what I suggest recently, that what would be really helpful for the agent as well as perhaps club families and the minors, that if football can have a database of this information which can be publicly available, for instance, I mean, that would be another excellent tool where then agents can verify and comply, but also other key stakeholders would know what that age is. And just again to re-emphasize, but the reason I said earlier in the discussion, this age restriction we see now under the FIFA football agent regulations is actually in the history of the agent regulations introduced by FIFA is first. Historically, we had these type of restrictions within the regulations of national associations. For instance, under English FA intermediate regulations, there's age restriction. That is when agent can approach or represent a minor, and that is from the 1st of January of the year the minor turned 16. We have seen that. But this is first time that FIFA actually introducing such regulatory requirement into its regulations. But then what we know, for instance, from the disciplinary actions taken by the English FA for regulatory breaches or regulatory non-compliance by agents, actually there is a significant number of cases relates to the breach of those provisions around the age restriction
so
for
people
the
still been doing
representation
it,
of minors.
Yeah.
So there was agents weren't following those rules. So therefore, hence again, that the regulatory understanding, regulatory literacy that I emphasize in my research is significantly important for agents in order to ensure then a better compliance by them in practice.
Brilliant. So you've been great yet again, coming in and informing us more about your research this time. And, lots of information there about the issues that were going on in the world of agents and for all stakeholders. So whether that be the player, the parents, the club and the agent, demonstrating some of those malpractices like human trafficking and things like that, or promises that weren't kept, all those kind of things that may be going on. You've told us about how you can try and stop these things going on, and really emphasising education as being the kind of key element to this, to help educate, first and foremost, agents, and making good practice for agents being probably your core centre of work at the moment. But I think moving forward, it'd be really interesting to see the education around clubs and around parents, because I think there has to be a stakeholder kind of relation there between that club and that parent, and making sure that those parents are provided with the right information in a timely manner. So thanks for being here. I know we've got another podcast that we may be doing in the future, so I look forward to seeing you again.
No, thanks for having me. It was a pleasure.
Thanks, mate.
Thanks for listening to the Experts in Sport podcast. If you'd like to get in touch, then please contact me, Martin Foster, at m.foster@loughborough.ac.uk. Thanks for listening. See you next time.